Agriculture played a major role in the early development of Robertson County and is still a major source of income for many of today's residents. Corn, wheat, and soybeans are a few of the county's major cash crops, but the influence of all three combined cannot compare with the influence that tobacco has played on Robertson County. Prior to the Civil War, tobacco was often referred to as a plantation crop, meaning it was economical to grow on a large scale. Robertson County's largest tobacco farm in the 1800s was a plantation known as Wessyngton Plantation. Located near Cedar Hill in Robertson County, Wessyngton Plantation specialized in dark-fired tobacco from the early 19th to the late 20th century. Joseph Washington, a cousin to former U.S. President George Washington, was a slave owner from Southampton, Virginia, who after the Revolutionary War moved his slaves to Tennessee in search of fertile soil at a low price. Joseph Washington and his slaves were among the first settlers in Robertson County to grow dark-fired tobacco. At the time of Washington's death in 1848, he had significantly increased his wealth. Following his death, his son, George A. Washington, took full control of the plantation.
George A. Washington took full control of the plantation, and he added a number of acres to the plantation till he increased it to 13,000 acres. I think in 1848, when Joseph died, he owned 4,700 acres, so that was a great increase in a short period of time. Joseph owned 79 slaves at his death, and in a 10-year period, George A. owned 274 of them.
By 1860, Wessyngton was the #1 largest producer of dark-fired tobacco in the United States and was #2 in the world. To produce such large amounts of dark-fired tobacco each year required back-breaking manual labor from hundreds of African American slaves. The 274 slaves raised an astonishing 250,000 pounds of tobacco annually, a number which still triumphs over today's standards. The outbreak of the Civil War in 1861, however, brought operations at Wessyngton to a halt. Many of Wessyngton's black men enlisted with the Union Army when the United States Colored Troops, or USCT, opened in Nashville in 1863. When the war was over, a few of the former Wessyngton slaves who had enlisted in the USCT returned to Wessyngton to farm, but many did not.
At the end of the war, Mr. George had 2 or 3 blind mules left, if I remember correctly. Some of his barns had been burned down, but the soldiers had really devastated the farm because they burned the fences, the rail fences, for firewood to keep themselves warm. So even if he had livestock or wanted to raise cows or whatever, he had difficulty keeping them corralled anywhere. One story is that even his daughters helped pick up iron from some of the buildings that had been burned or to sell so that they would have money. But Mr. George fared much better than most of the regular citizens in this area, since he did have assets and had a lot of property.
Following the Civil War, the tobacco market prospered, and George Washington was able to rebuild Wessyngton.
In addition to tobacco production at Wessyngton, there was also a large market for Washington hams. Washington hams could be found on the menus of the finest restaurants as far south as New Orleans and as far north as Philadelphia. Each year, thousands of hogs were killed at Wessyngton to make the famous Washington hams, and also a large number were killed to support the slave population at Wessyngton Plantation. Also, there was a large liquor operation at Wessyngton. They had vast apple and peach orchards where they made peach and apple brandy, and all the products produced on the plantation were shipped by flatboat to New Orleans, where it was sold on the open market there.
In 1892, he died, and the plantation was distributed among his children. Joseph E. Washington George's son and grandson of the original Joseph Washington, was later elected to the U.S. Congress. Another notable farm connected to the Wessyngton is the Glenraven Plantation. It is an 800-acre estate in Cedar Hill that was part of the original Washington farm. Jane Washington, George Washington's daughter, and her husband, Felix Grundy Ewing, completed the Glenraven Mansion in 1902. It had its own school, church, store, post office, mill, and blacksmith to accommodate the dozens of families that worked for the Ewings. When Joseph E. Washington died in 1915, his real estate was valued at $519,000, a property value that was 78 times the average of all property holders in Robertson County at that time. Both Wessyngton and Glenraven Mansions still stand in their original locations and are both listed in the National Register of Historic Places.